66 million years ago, Earth was ruled by giants. The late Cretaceous period was a time of extraordinary life. The continents had begun to drift into shapes we would recognize today. The climate was warm, the sea levels high, and vegetation stretched across most of the planet. Towering forests of conifers, ferns, and flowering plants formed a vibrant green world teeming with activity. The skies were filled with flying reptiles, and the oceans were patrolled by giant marine reptiles. But on land, the true rulers were the dinosaurs. Herds of massive herbivores moved across floodplains and valleys. Creatures like Triceratops, with its three-horned face and frilled neck, grazed in open clearings. Nearby, ankylosaurs with armored backs and clubbed tails wandered slowly, breaking low branches with their beaked mouths. The air vibrated with the distant calls of flying pterosaurs and early birds flitting between branches. Towering above them all stood the apex predator of the time, the Tyrannosaurus rex. This massive carnivore, with jaws capable of crushing bone and a sense of smell sharper than any living animal today, stalked through the forests. Its heavy steps thudded against the ground as it moved through its territory. With each breath, it surveyed the land, alert to the faintest movement. Its presence alone was enough to send smaller animals scattering. Despite its dominance, the Tyrannosaurus rex shared its world with many other predators and scavengers. Dromaeosaurs, fast and feathered with sickle-shaped claws, hunted in coordinated packs. Smaller carnivores scavenged the remains of larger kills, cleaning the forest floor of decay. It was a balanced world, harsh and beautiful, ruled by instinct, survival, and the endless cycle of life and death. In the warm, shallow seas that cut through the continents, massive mosasaurs ruled. These marine reptiles, longer than school buses, moved like underwater missiles. With double-hinged jaws and backward-pointing teeth, they could swallow prey whole. Ammonites and schools of fish darted through coral reefs, while turtles and plesiosaurs drifted near the surface. The oceans were just as dynamic and deadly as the land above. In the sky, giant pterosaurs glided on wingspans that could reach over 30 feet. They scanned the ground below, searching for prey or carrion. Early birds, much smaller and feathered, began to explore the airspace, flapping between branches and catching insects in mid-flight. Their songs and calls added life to the dense green canopies. The environment was a delicate balance, shaped by millions of years of evolution. Ecosystems stretched across the continents, each filled with intricate relationships between predator and prey, plant and pollinator, climate and creature. Seasons passed with familiar rhythms. Rains came and went, feeding rivers and swamps. Dry periods tested the resilience of the fittest. It was a world in motion, constantly changing, yet stable enough for life to thrive. Some species had been around for tens of millions of years. Others were recent arrivals, still adapting to their surroundings. Flowering plants had only recently begun to dominate, transforming ecosystems and offering new sources of food for herbivores. Insects evolved alongside them, forming symbiotic partnerships that shaped entire landscapes. Above it all, the sun shone through scattered clouds, warming the forests, deserts, mountains, and seas. The sky looked the same as it does now, but something unseen was coming. Something far beyond the clouds, beyond the moon, beyond anything any creature on Earth could sense. An object was moving through the cold darkness of space, heading straight for the blue planet. It had traveled for millions of years, unnoticed and silent. It had no intention, no will, no awareness. But it carried the power to end worlds. On Earth, there were no signs, no warnings. The animals continued their lives as they always had. The Tyrannosaurus rex hunted with confidence, unaware that its species had only days left. The Triceratops grazed peacefully, generations passing in the span of decades. Pterosaurs glided through thermal winds, utterly oblivious to the force hurtling toward their planet. If the dinosaurs could sense time the way humans do, they might have noticed small changes. A subtle shift in temperature, odd colors in the sky during twilight, disturbances in the migration of birds. But these changes were too minor, too fleeting to alarm creatures adapted to a volatile world. For millions of years, the Earth had been shaped by slow forces. Tectonic plates drifting, volcanoes erupting, climates shifting gradually over epochs. Life had time to adapt, to evolve. But now, everything was about to change in an instant. Not over millennia, not even centuries. In one day, life on Earth would be permanently altered. The asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers in diameter, was made of rock and metal. It moved through space at over 60,000 kilometers per hour. It had no light of its own, but as it approached the Earth, it began to glow. Friction from the atmosphere turning it into a fireball of cosmic fury. In its final moments, it became visible in the sky as a second sun, blazing brighter than anything the dinosaurs had ever seen. Yet even then, there was no understanding, no panic, no preparation. The animals looked to the sky, perhaps pausing at the strange light, but none knew what was coming. They had survived predators, droughts, floods, and volcanic eruptions. But this was different. This was beyond the scale of anything life had ever endured. The peace of the Cretaceous was about to be shattered. Entire lineages of creatures, vast forests, complex ecosystems, everything that had taken hundreds of millions of years to develop would be undone in the blink of an eye. Above the Earth, the asteroid closed in. The final seconds counted down. Below, the world continued as it always had. A mother Triceratops nudged her young forward through tall grass. A Tyrannosaurus rex tore flesh from a fallen hadrosaur. Mosasaurus swam beneath the waves, chasing prey through coral reefs. Pterosaurs soared through the humid air, riding the currents of the late afternoon. And then, in one flash of light, the age of dinosaurs began to end. Far beyond Earth, in the cold, black void of space, an object drifted. It had no consciousness, no purpose, no malice. Yet its arrival would mark the end of a world. This object was an asteroid, a massive chunk of rock and metal born from the debris of an ancient collision somewhere in the early solar system. It may have been part of a shattered protoplanet or debris left over from the chaotic early days of planetary formation. For millions of years, it had floated through space in silence, untouched and undisturbed, circling the sun on a long elliptical path. Unlike the sun or stars, the asteroid gave off no light. It was invisible against the vast black backdrop of space. Only its shadow crossed the stars. It moved at speeds beyond human comprehension, traveling over 60,000 kilometers per hour. It passed through gravitational fields, brushed by planets, and shifted slightly with every encounter. Yet nothing slowed it, nothing stopped it. It was a bullet fired through time, aimed directly at a living, breathing planet. On Earth, life flourished in ignorance. The dinosaurs continued their reign, as they had for over 150 million years. The continents had drifted into new positions. Inland seas had formed and receded. Forests had grown, died, and grown again. All the while, this asteroid moved closer, each orbit bringing it nearer to its fatal encounter. It is likely that this asteroid originated in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Perhaps the gravitational pull of Jupiter nudged it from its stable path, sending it on a collision course with Earth. A small disturbance, imperceptible over short timescales, was enough to seal the fate of entire ecosystems. Space is a realm of chaos and balance, and every orbit carries the potential for destruction. The final approach began. The asteroid now entered the inner solar system. It passed Mars and accelerated further, pulled by the gravity of the Sun and the Earth. The planet it now targeted spun on its axis, its blue oceans reflecting the sunlight, its continents buzzing with life. From above, Earth looked peaceful. Clouds drifted over green lands. Storms swirled in tropical zones. Rivers flowed like veins through the landscape. All of it oblivious to the visitor from beyond. The asteroid crossed the Moon's orbit and entered Earth's gravitational field. It now fell toward the planet with unstoppable force. It was roughly 10 kilometers wide, larger than Mount Everest, and weighed trillions of tons. Its impact velocity would exceed 20 kilometers per second. This was not just a rock. It was a weapon forged by the universe itself, capable of ending the Age of Giants. As it descended, it began to compress the air in front of it, heating it until the atmosphere glowed white-hot. From the surface of Earth, it may have appeared as a second sun rising in the sky. For a few brief moments, it lit the world with an unnatural brilliance, casting long shadows and creating a heat wave before it even touched the ground. This was the moment when time ran out. No creature on Earth could understand what was coming. No survival instinct could prepare them. The Tyrannosaurus rex, the Triceratops, the Hadrosaurs, the Ankylosaurs all continued their lives under a sky that would soon burn. In the oceans, Mosasaurs patrolled reefs unaware. In the sky, Petrosaurs glided through thermals without fear. And in the forests, mammals scurried through underbrush, perhaps sensing a disturbance, but unable to grasp its meaning. The asteroid streaked downward, glowing brighter by the second. The air around it ignited, turning the skies into fire. Birds fell from trees. Animals paused, confused by the light and the pressure wave approaching ahead of the impact. Then, in an instant, it struck. But that moment is for later. Now we remain in space, just before the collision, watching the final seconds unfold. From the vacuum of orbit, the asteroid's impact looked like a star exploding on the surface of Earth. A blinding flash erupted from the Yucatan region. Within milliseconds, the crust of the planet buckled and vaporized. Rock turned to gas. Molten debris shot into the sky, reaching beyond the atmosphere and into space. A plume of white and red erupted outward, as if the planet itself had been wounded. Shock waves radiated from the impact site, traveling through the crust faster than sound. Within minutes, they would trigger earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across the globe. A crater nearly 200 kilometers wide would form in what is now the Gulf of Mexico. It would be known to future scientists as the Chicxulub crater. In space, debris launched from the explosion began to fall back toward the planet. These fragments, some the size of cities, re-entered the atmosphere at high speeds. As they fell, they superheated the air, creating a global furnace. The upper atmosphere glowed. Friction turned the sky into fire. The asteroid itself had already done its job. In less than a second, it delivered energy equivalent to over 100 million megatons of TNT. That is more than 1 billion times more powerful than the atomic bombs used in the 20th century. The explosion was beyond human scale. It was a planetary event, a force that reshaped the biosphere in a single day. Yet even after this, the worst was still to come. The firestorms, the tsunamis, the ash clouds, the global darkness. These would unfold over hours, days, and weeks. They would suffocate the Earth slowly, pushing species to extinction not just through violence, but through starvation, exposure, and ecological collapse. And it had all begun with a silent object in space. Something that carried no hate, no intention, no design, only momentum and mass. And that was enough. The asteroid's arrival reminds us of how fragile life is, even on a planet as large and diverse as Earth. Everything that breathes, crawls, swims, or flies depends on the delicate balance of sunlight, air, water, and food. Disturb that balance, even for a few weeks, and entire lineages can disappear forever. As the Earth groaned from the first waves of destruction, the story of the dinosaurs was reaching its final chapter. In the silence of space, their fate had been decided long before the skies lit up. The asteroid was only the messenger. Below, life still clung to existence, but everything had changed. The age of dinosaurs was no longer a certainty. It was now a memory in the making. In a single instant, Earth changed forever. When the asteroid struck, the force it released was beyond all human comparison. One moment, the skies over what is now the Yucatan Peninsula were filled with the ordinary sounds of Cretaceous life. Insects buzzed, birds called. In the distance, a herd of hadrosaurs crossed a riverbank. Then came the flash. Before sound arrived, before shock waves hit, there was light, an unbearable light, brighter than the sun. The entire region was illuminated as if caught in a silent explosion. Shadows sharpened, then vanished, replaced by searing white as the asteroid collided with Earth's surface. The impact site was a shallow sea, covered by warm waters and coral reefs. When the asteroid hit, it penetrated miles into the crust, vaporizing everything in its path. Rock, water, and the asteroid itself were instantly turned to plasma. Temperatures exceeded 10,000 degrees Celsius. A fireball expanded outward, leveling everything for hundreds of kilometers. The ocean around the site boiled away in seconds. Reefs, fish, marine reptiles, and microscopic organisms were annihilated before they could react. A shock wave blasted through the atmosphere. Moving faster than the speed of sound, it flattened forests hundreds of kilometers from ground zero. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Animals were thrown through the air. Even creatures not in the immediate vicinity were deafened or killed by the force of the pressure wave. As the ground trembled, a massive plume of molten rock, dust, and superheated gas shot into the sky. This debris pierced the atmosphere and entered space, forming a vast mushroom cloud that would soon encircle the globe. Pieces of Earth itself were flung out of orbit. Molten rock rained back down across the planet, igniting wildfires wherever they landed. Within minutes, the Earth was lit with fire. Entire continents experienced temperatures that cooked the upper layers of the soil. Vegetation burst into flames. Creatures caught in the open were scorched. Even deep underground, the tremors collapsed burrows, fractured rock, and disrupted underground ecosystems. Beneath the oceans, the seismic waves triggered undersea landslides and submarine earthquakes. Tsunamis began to rise, some reaching over 1,000 feet tall. They raced across the ancient Tethys Ocean and crashed into distant shores. Wave after wave pounded coastlines, washing away coastal forests and dragging land animals into the depths. As chaos spread, massive amounts of sulfur and carbon dioxide were released from the impact site. These gases mixed with water vapor, forming acid rain that began to fall across the Earth. It poisoned lakes, rivers, and soil. Plants withered. Fresh water systems turned toxic. The balance of life, carefully sustained for millions of years, was breaking apart. All of this happened in the first hour, but the most devastating consequences had only just begun. In the upper atmosphere, dust and aerosols formed a thick global shroud. Sunlight struggled to reach the surface. Day faded into a long twilight. Photosynthesis slowed, then stopped. Without sunlight, plants could no longer grow. Herbivores found nothing to eat. Carnivores soon followed, their prey starving or disappearing entirely. In the days after the impact, temperatures plummeted. The heat of the first fires gave way to cold. As sunlight vanished behind the clouds, global temperatures fell by several degrees. A nuclear winter had begun. The planet entered a state of darkness and chill, a deep freeze not caused by ice but by ash and silence. The extinction began swiftly. In North America, the closest landmass to the impact, ecosystems collapsed almost overnight. The Tyrannosaurus rex, once king of the continent, could find no food. Its powerful body, built for dominance, was now a burden. Smaller scavengers tried to survive on the few remaining carcasses, but even they faced starvation as the chain of life unraveled. Further south, giant sauropods and horned dinosaurs met the same fate. In the oceans, plankton populations crashed without sunlight. This disrupted the entire marine food web. Creatures like ammonites and marine reptiles vanished in massive numbers. The mosasaurs, apex predators of the sea, found themselves without prey and slowly faded into extinction. The rains continued. The skies remained dim. Firestorms turned to fog. And across the globe, silence replaced the once vibrant chorus of life. No more calls of triceratops echoing through valleys. No more herds of hadrosaurs migrating across ancient plains. No more wing beats of giant pterosaurs overhead. They were gone, not in centuries or decades, but in weeks and months. Fossil records show that 3 out of every 4 species on Earth perished. The impact had not only removed the dinosaurs from the planet, it had erased vast portions of the living world. Forests vanished. Insects died off in huge numbers. Coral reefs collapsed. It was not just a mass extinction, it was an erasure. And yet, not everything died. In the shadow of destruction, life clung to the edges. Small mammals, able to burrow and eat a wider variety of food, managed to survive. Some birds, descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, adapted and endured. Certain amphibians and reptiles made it through the dark months. Fungi thrived in the dead forests, breaking down decaying matter and recycling the nutrients of the fallen world. Deep in the oceans, near thermal vents, bacteria continued to feed on minerals from the planet's crust. In these hidden places, life refused to vanish. But on the surface, the world had changed. The Cretaceous period had ended. The age of dinosaurs was over. And the moment it happened was not stretched across centuries. It happened in seconds, beginning with a flash of light and ending in a world of ash. The impact crater, now buried beneath layers of sediment and jungle in the Yucatan Peninsula, remains a scar on the Earth, a reminder of the day the planet was struck by a force from beyond, a moment so violent it reset the course of life itself. Millions of years later, humans would find this crater. They would study its rocks, measure its depth, and discover the global layer of iridium-rich dust that marked the boundary between 2 ages. They would understand that the dinosaurs had not simply vanished. They were destroyed, almost instantly, by an object from space. That moment, frozen in geologic time, became a turning point in the story of life. One world ended so that another could begin. The asteroid had struck, but the destruction did not end with the impact. In many ways, the blast was just the opening act of a much greater catastrophe. The Earth itself, wounded and trembling, responded with fury. The force of the collision triggered a global chain reaction, unlocking destruction from deep within the planet. Within minutes of the impact, the ground beneath the Yucatan Peninsula convulsed violently. Seismic waves radiated outward through the crust, crossing continents in all directions. These were not ordinary earthquakes. These were superquakes, powerful enough to crack bedrock and shift fault lines across entire landmasses. The ground rolled like ocean waves. Forests fell. Mountains shook. Ancient valleys collapsed into themselves. Rivers changed course. Lakes drained through ruptured earth. Thousands of kilometers from the impact site, animals froze mid-step as the ground buckled beneath them. Herds scattered in panic. Nests were abandoned. Trees snapped and fell like dominoes. In the oceans, undersea earthquakes unleashed massive landslides, sending walls of water rising from the deep. Waves hundreds of feet tall surged toward the shorelines. These were not ordinary tsunamis. They carried the energy of a planet in distress. The coastlines of the ancient world were reshaped in hours. Waves crashed upon the land, racing inland for miles, sweeping away everything in their path. Forests were torn apart. Low-lying dinosaur nesting grounds were flooded. Creatures that had survived the initial blast were now drowning in the rising waters. Salt water mixed with freshwater ecosystems, poisoning lakes and rivers. Fish and amphibians died by the millions. But the ocean was not the only element turned against life. Fire, too, became a global predator. As molten debris from the impact rained back through the atmosphere, it ignited the sky. Each chunk of rock superheated the air around it. The skies turned orange, then red, then a blinding white as countless fragments re-entered the atmosphere like blazing arrows. Across the globe, forests burst into flames. Entire landscapes were engulfed. The fires did not spread slowly from tree to tree. They ignited from above, setting vast areas alight in seconds. The air became thick with smoke. Oxygen levels dropped. The heat from the skies roasted the surface of the earth. It was not just a series of wildfires. It was a firestorm without precedent. Inland plains, jungles, and even wetlands became infernos. Creatures that had once found shelter in the underbrush now found themselves trapped. Dinosaurs attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Fire came from every direction, and the smoke choked every breath. Even armored giants like ankylosaurs were powerless. They collapsed, their massive bodies unable to withstand the heat. In the northern hemisphere, night fell under a sky filled with flame. Stars vanished. Clouds glowed with a hellish red. Ash began to fall like snow, coating the scorched ground in layers of gray. The temperature soared in places far from the crater. Even those who survived the impact and the tsunamis now faced the wrath of a burning planet. Beneath the Earth, magma chambers stirred. The shock of the impact disturbed volcanic systems on a global scale. Faults cracked open, mountains bled lava. In regions already prone to eruptions, the Earth's crust erupted with renewed violence. Ash clouds rose high into the atmosphere, mixing with debris from the asteroid itself. Gases like sulfur dioxide filled the air, spreading across the globe in high-altitude currents. Acid rain began to fall. It burned through leaves, dissolved plankton, and turned freshwater lakes into toxic pools. Soil chemistry changed. The nutrient cycle collapsed. Even in areas not touched by fire or flood, life began to wither. Ecosystems that had been stable for millions of years unraveled in a matter of days. In the oceans, the situation was just as dire. With fires raging on land and volcanoes erupting beneath the sea, temperatures began to fluctuate. Oxygen levels in the water dropped. Marine life, already disoriented by the darkness, now faced anoxic conditions. Coral reefs turned pale and crumbled. Plankton, the foundation of the marine food chain, struggled to survive in acidic, oxygen-starved water. The mosasaurs, apex predators of the ancient seas, found fewer and fewer fish to hunt. Their enormous size became a disadvantage. Unable to adapt quickly enough, their numbers began to fall. Even deep-sea ecosystems, usually untouched by surface events, were disturbed. The entire planet had become unstable. The firestorms and earthquakes did more than destroy. They created a planet-wide haze that would soon alter the very nature of the atmosphere. Soot, ash, and chemicals formed a dense layer that blocked sunlight. Plants withered. The temperature dropped. The surface of the Earth, once lush and vibrant, began to resemble a wasteland. In the ruins of the forests, the silence was profound. The songs of birds were gone. The heavy steps of the Tyrannosaurus rex were no longer heard. Herds that once thundered across plains had vanished. Scattered bodies, scorched trees, and smoldering soil marked the end of an age. The Earth had been broken not just physically, but biologically. And still, the devastation continued. The planet now suffered from a feedback loop of destruction. Fire had stripped away vegetation, leaving soils exposed. Rains, now acidic and unpredictable, washed away what remained. Erosion accelerated. Entire hillsides collapsed into rivers. Sediment clogged waterways. Fish and amphibians died as their habitats vanished or turned lethal. The animals that had survived the initial waves of destruction now faced a slow, creeping death. Food was scarce. Clean water was rare. The air was heavy with toxins. Scavengers searched for carcasses but found only ash and bones. Large dinosaurs, unable to adapt quickly or travel far, began to starve. Smaller creatures hid in burrows, clinging to the last pockets of livable space. Yet life did not give up. Beneath the ashes, some seeds waited. Underground, some eggs remained unhatched. In the deepest lakes and caves, in isolated valleys and sheltered coasts, life held on. Not in the form it had before, but in a more fragile, reduced state. Evolution had no favorites, only survivors. Earthquakes still shook the land weeks after the impact. Aftershocks, some nearly as powerful as the initial quakes, struck repeatedly. The crust remained unsettled. In some regions, entire mountain ranges lifted slightly. Elsewhere, valleys deepened. The physical geography of the planet was reshaped in the wake of the collision. Millions of years later, traces of this violence would be found in the rocks. A thin layer of soot and iridium, rare on Earth but common in asteroids, would form a global boundary in the geological record, a line marking the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleogene. Scientists would dig through layers of time and find a scar that matched the violence preserved in fossils and sediments. But for those who lived through it, the impact was not history. It was their final day. The firestorms, the quakes, the sky that turned to flame. These were not just events. They were endings. Each one closing the chapter on a different species, a different ecosystem, a different way of life. In the ashes of a broken world, the stage was being cleared. The age of dinosaurs was ending, not with a single explosion, but with a storm of fire and stone and silence. As the asteroid shattered the Earth's crust and vaporized land and sea, the oceans responded with a force of their own. The shallow sea where the asteroid struck collapsed instantly, replaced by a gaping hole of molten rock and fire. Around this void, water surged outward and upward in a massive dome before collapsing back with unimaginable violence. It was here that the planet's next great weapon was unleashed. Waves taller than mountains, tsunamis that would sweep across the globe and destroy life far from the crater. The initial wave towered nearly a mile high. It raced away from the impact site in all directions, gaining speed and power. In open water, it moved faster than a commercial jetliner, carrying the energy of continents. For the creatures beneath the sea, there was no escape. Schools of fish were torn apart by turbulence. Giant marine reptiles like mosasaurs were tossed through currents and crushed against reefs or buried under collapsing seabeds. Entire coral systems were flattened. The ocean floor itself cracked and shifted under the sudden redistribution of water and pressure. Nearby coastlines were the first to be hit. In the hours after impact, ancient beaches, swamps, and mangrove forests were obliterated. Waves slammed into land, rising higher as they encountered shallower waters. The energy of the impact carried them far inland, sweeping away forests, dinosaurs, and everything in their path. Nests were destroyed, eggs were crushed. Herds of hadrosaurs caught in migration were swallowed whole. Even massive sauropods, among the largest animals to ever walk the Earth, were dragged away like driftwood. Further from the crater, the tsunamis kept moving. They wrapped around continents, refracting and combining, sometimes amplifying each other into waves of even greater height. South America, North Africa, and Eastern North America all experienced flooding on a scale never seen before or since. Valleys became lakes, rivers reversed direction, floodplains turned into temporary seas. The waters carried more than just death. They were filled with debris from distant lands, broken trees, boulders, splintered bones, and the shattered remains of ecosystems. Sharp rocks and sediment scoured the ground as the waves advanced and receded, tearing away soil and reshaping the land. When the water returned to the sea, it carried with it the remains of entire forests and animal populations, leaving behind nothing but silence and mud. Underwater, the seismic energy released by the impact triggered massive landslides on continental slopes. Great volumes of sediment collapsed into the deep ocean, sending further shockwaves through the water. New waves formed from these disturbances, creating secondary tsunamis that arrived hours later in regions already devastated. The destruction came not in a single strike, but in waves, literal and unrelenting. Small islands vanished entirely. Coastal habitats that had flourished for millions of years were erased. Wetlands that had served as breeding grounds for amphibians and insects were swallowed and replaced by salt water. Even airborne creatures were not spared. Flocks of pterosaurs attempting to flee the floods were thrown from the sky by wind and spray or collided with debris in the chaos. They fell into the water and drowned as their fragile wings soaked and tore. The tsunamis changed more than just the landscape. They altered the chemistry of the planet. Seawater carried into inland ecosystems left behind layers of salt, killing plants that had managed to survive the fires. Freshwater lakes and rivers were diluted or overtaken, killing fish and amphibians adapted to specific conditions. Entire food webs collapsed, not from fire or darkness, but from water that should never have been there. The force of the waves also stirred the deep ocean, bringing nutrients and toxins from the seafloor up to the surface. This sudden mixing disrupted the delicate balance of marine ecosystems. In some places, it triggered temporary blooms of plankton and algae. In others, it led to dead zones, regions where oxygen was depleted so severely that nothing could survive. Beneath the waves, silence returned slowly, but the ocean had changed. The creatures that once ruled the seas, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, were vanishing. Their hunting grounds were gone, their prey depleted. They were apex predators in a world that no longer had room for giants. Their extinction would follow soon after, not in fire or flood, but in starvation and emptiness. Along the coasts, when the waters finally receded, they left behind a new world. The once lush shorelines were now fields of mud, scattered with bones and broken trees. Pools of stagnant water collected in the craters and lowlands, breeding disease and decay. Scavengers moved slowly through the wreckage, picking through the remains, but there was little to find. Those that survived the waves were left in a ruined landscape. Dinosaurs that escaped the fires now faced drowning or the collapse of their habitats. Plant life had been stripped away. The soil was saturated and salted. The sun, already dimmed by the ash in the atmosphere, offered no warmth or hope of regrowth. Predators wandered starving across barren ground. Prey animals disappeared, not hunted but erased by the sea. Some of the smallest creatures fared the best. Burrowing mammals, amphibians that could find temporary refuge in mud, and a few adaptable reptiles managed to survive. Their small size, varied diets, and ability to shelter underground gave them a fragile advantage in a world that had turned against the large and the specialized. They clung to what little remained. The planet's weather systems, now destabilized by the combined effects of fire, atmospheric debris, and ocean disruption, began to shift rapidly. Rainfall became unpredictable, wind patterns reversed. The oceans, heated unevenly by the darkness above and the turmoil below, generated violent storms. Regions that had once been temperate were now lashed by hurricane-force winds. The survivors of the tsunami apocalypse now had to endure a climate unraveling around them. The tsunamis had done more than destroy. They had rewritten the map of life on Earth. Rivers changed course. Coastlines retreated or advanced by hundreds of kilometers. Entire islands were relocated, eroded, or submerged. Valleys became salt marshes. Ancient lakes turned into inland seas. The memory of the land was altered permanently. Millions of years later, the fossil record would preserve the evidence. Layers of sediment deposited in chaotic, jumbled patterns. Marine fossils found inland, far from where oceans currently reach. Dinosaur skeletons crushed and twisted in muddy beds alongside ancient seashells. These were the remnants of the flood, the physical record of the day when the oceans rose and claimed the land. In the aftermath of the impact, the tsunamis were just one wave of destruction, but they carried the unique violence of water, a force both gentle and absolute. Where fire burned and smoke suffocated, the tsunami drowned everything in silence. It left behind no flame, only stillness and loss. And yet, deep in the mud, seeds remained. In cracks of stone and untouched pockets of shelter, life waited. Not ready to begin again, not yet, but present. The water had washed away much, but it had not taken everything. In time, life would return, but the world it came back to would never be the same. As the tsunamis receded and the earth cracked from within, the skies above turned into the most terrifying part of the extinction. Long after the asteroid had slammed into the shallow seas of the Yucatan, its wrath rose upward. It wasn't only the land and oceans that suffered. The atmosphere itself became a weapon. Within seconds of the impact, trillions of tons of pulverized rock, sulfur, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and microscopic particles were ejected into the air. The force was so violent that material from the Earth's crust was thrown beyond the planet's atmosphere and into space, forming an arc of glowing debris before gravity slowly began to pull it back. But before that debris returned, the sky had already begun to burn. Molten fragments of rock, launched high above the Earth, began to rain back down. Each piece re-entered the atmosphere at high velocity. Friction turned these falling stones into fireballs. They streaked across the sky by the millions, heating the upper atmosphere until it glowed. The sky, once blue and filled with clouds, became a dome of flame. This re-entry of incandescent rock didn't just light the sky. It superheated the air itself. The upper layers of the atmosphere reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. The infrared radiation generated by this sudden heat pulse was enough to cook the surface of the planet below. It was as if an invisible oven door had opened and the entire Earth was trapped inside. Across the globe, plants burst into flame spontaneously. Dry leaves, needles, and grasses ignited under the intense radiative heat. Even moist forests, far from the impact site and untouched by falling rock, erupted into wildfire. Creatures had no warning. There was no smoke at first, no spark, only heat, sudden and absolute. Entire herds of dinosaurs collapsed mid-stride. Their bodies, too large to find shelter, were overwhelmed by heat before they understood the danger. Insects, once the most resilient and widespread animals, died in massive numbers. Their small bodies could not endure the atmospheric furnace. Birds, those that had escaped the initial firestorms, fell from the sky. Their feathers ignited, their wings collapsed. Flying reptiles, once the rulers of the air, vanished in silence. Those beneath the ocean surface weren't safe either. The heat reached shallow seas, boiling them from above. Marine plankton, the base of the oceanic food chain, were sterilized en masse. Coral reefs, already disrupted by tsunamis, began to die under thermal stress. Oxygen levels dropped. Photosynthesis in the ocean ceased. Light no longer reached the depths. Everything grew dark, acidic, and still. On land, the fires spread with terrifying speed. There were no fire breaks, no containment. Continents were wrapped in flames. Forests that had stood for millions of years were reduced to ash in hours. The smoke rose and mixed with ash, soot, and vapor from the impact. The result was a planetary haze, thick and impenetrable, stretching from horizon to horizon. As the fires died down, they left behind a ruined surface. Blackened trees, charred bones, scorched earth. The atmosphere, now clogged with soot and sulfur, began to change in other ways. It blocked the sun's rays from reaching the surface. What had once been unbearable heat now shifted to suffocating cold. This rapid transition triggered what scientists now call an impact winter. Temperatures around the globe dropped dramatically. With the sun obscured, photosynthesis stopped almost completely. Plants withered. Flowering species dropped their leaves and entered dormancy, but many failed to recover. Food sources vanished. Herbivores starved. Carnivores soon followed. The sun, once the life-giver of Earth, became a faint disk behind a gray veil. Days passed in a dim twilight. Nights grew longer and colder. The planet was caught between fire and frost. Seasons no longer followed familiar patterns. It rained where it should have snowed. It froze where it should have bloomed. Entire climate systems collapsed. The sulfur dioxide launched into the stratosphere by both the asteroid and the fires formed aerosols that reflected sunlight away from the planet. This kept the cooling in place for years, and when it did rain, that rain carried sulfur and carbonic acid with it. This acid rain stripped nutrients from the soil and leached into water supplies. Rivers turned toxic. Lakes became hostile. Amphibians, already suffering, faced a second extinction wave. As time passed, the haze in the sky turned into a permanent cloak. The sky on fire had not only burned the planet, it had buried it in shadow. What life remained did so in isolation, disconnected, disoriented, and diminishing. In the fossil record, a fine line marks this moment. A global layer rich in soot and iridium spread across every continent. It tells of a time when the world went dark, when the fires in the sky gave way to a silence so deep it was etched into stone. Survival depended on size, adaptability, and luck. Large animals, especially dinosaurs, required enormous amounts of food and stable environments. Both vanished. Their extinction became inevitable. Even apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex, once able to bring down massive prey, now wandered starving, confused, and doomed. But smaller life forms had a better chance. Mammals the size of rats, feeding on anything they could find, burrowed and waited. Their metabolisms, lower and more efficient, allowed them to endure longer without food. Some birds, descended from smaller feathered dinosaurs, found shelter and survived. Insects, fungi, and bacteria began the slow work of reclaiming the Earth. The sky, once the domain of flight, had become a memory of terror, and yet it too would begin to clear. Over years, then decades, the atmosphere slowly cleansed itself. Rainfall returned in patterns, though altered. Sunlight began to pierce the haze in scattered beams, and the Earth, scarred and stripped, prepared for something it had always known: renewal. But in that moment, as fire fell from above and the world was cast into ash and ice, life had been broken. The age of dinosaurs had ended, not in a slow fade, but in a single blaze of cosmic fury. The sky on fire was their final sky, a warning written across the heavens, glowing in the last light of an age. After the fires dimmed and the skies stopped raining molten rock, a new kind of silence fell upon the Earth. It was not the quiet that follows destruction, but the silence of absence. The sun, which had nourished every leaf, every ocean current, every breath of life, was gone. Not literally, but effectively. Sunlight, once scattered across forests and oceans, was now sealed behind a thick and endless veil. Day and night became nearly indistinguishable, and beneath that dim, gray sky, the Earth began to freeze. The asteroid impact had thrown a shroud around the planet. The superheated ejecta that once lit the sky on fire had now cooled and thickened into a global layer of dust, ash, soot, and sulfur aerosols. This atmospheric blanket was suspended high above the surface, beyond the reach of rain, drifting through the stratosphere like a suffocating fog. It was not weather, it was a planetary cloak of darkness. Sunlight tried to reach the surface, but most of it was reflected away. The warmth that once sustained photosynthesis and regulated climate was now scattered back into space. What little light did break through was weak and cold, casting a pale glow that barely moved shadows. The rhythm of the Earth had been severed. The balance between light and dark, warmth and cool, had collapsed. Plants were the first to suffer. Without light, photosynthesis ceased. Leaves drooped and fell. Flowering plants shed their petals, unable to sustain themselves. Conifers browned and collapsed. Ferns shriveled into dust. Grasses yellowed and died. Forests across the globe began to rot in place. Their roots, once embedded in rich, sun-fed soil, now found only poison and cold. As vegetation disappeared, so too did those who depended on it. Herbivorous dinosaurs faced immediate starvation. Species that had once roamed in vast herds across ancient plains could no longer find food. Their strength, their numbers, their adaptations, none of it mattered now. The ground was bare, the trees were hollow. The world had gone dark, and with it, the foundation of every ecosystem. Without prey, carnivorous dinosaurs followed.
The mighty Tyrannosaurus rex, top predator of its time, found its territory empty. Where once there had been abundance, now there was only decay. Bones without flesh, water without life, hunger without end. The giant predators, unable to adapt, fell silent.
The darkness reached the oceans as well. Light could no longer penetrate the surface. The thin, transparent layer where plankton once bloomed became a dead zone. Phytoplankton, the foundation of the marine food chain, died off in massive numbers. This collapse rippled outward. Zooplankton followed, then small fish, then larger predators. Mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, dominant hunters of the deep, found their world unraveling in silence. They vanished, not in a violent end, but in the long, slow hunger of a dying sea. Entire oceanic systems collapsed. Coral reefs bleached and crumbled. Shellfish perished as ocean chemistry changed, turning more acidic from the carbon dioxide released into the air and absorbed by the water. Filter feeders, reliant on a constant supply of microscopic food, starved. Seabirds that had survived the initial shock now found nothing to hunt. They dropped from the skies or washed ashore, wings spread like broken sails. On land, the cold deepened. Temperatures dropped by several degrees. Frost spread across regions that had never known snow. Weather patterns broke down. Without the sun to heat the earth, wind currents lost their momentum. Rainfall became erratic. Droughts alternated with floods. Storms formed and stalled, bringing destruction with nowhere to go. The earth had no rhythm, no cycle, only imbalance. Acid rain continued to fall. Sulfur from the impact mixed with atmospheric moisture to create droplets so acidic they burned through leaves and stripped nutrients from the soil. Fresh water turned toxic. Lakes became death traps. Amphibians with sensitive skin suffered severe population crashes. Even insects, which had survived countless upheavals in Earth's history, were reduced to a fraction of their former numbers. Fungi thrived. In the absence of light and the dominance of decay, mold and mushrooms rose from the soil. Their networks spread through the fallen trees, feeding on death and turning forests into fungal kingdoms. For a time, the Earth belonged not to green and growing life, but to the decomposers. They flourished in the darkness, breaking down the remains of a former world. Some animals clung to existence. Burrowing mammals, small reptiles, and a few adaptable bird species survived in isolated pockets. Their metabolisms allowed them to eat less. Their habits kept them hidden from the worst of the cold and hunger. In caves, in deep crevices, in sheltered valleys, life persisted, not in strength, but in resistance. The darkness lasted for months. In some places, it lingered for years. And even as the clouds began to thin, the planet did not simply recover. Light returned gradually, filtered and weak at first, but the damage had already been done. By the time the sun shone clearly again, the world it illuminated was unrecognizable. The extinction had swept across land, sea, and sky. 3/4 of all species on Earth had vanished. Not just the dinosaurs, but marine reptiles, flying reptiles, plants, insects, corals, mollusks, plankton. Entire evolutionary lineages were cut short. The biosphere had been rebooted. The previous rulers were gone. The survivors were few. Millions of years later, the evidence of the lost sunlight would be found in rocks. A boundary of clay, rich in iridium and soot, marking the line between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Scientists would uncover it across the world. In Italy, in New Zealand, in North America. It told a global story, not of war or disease or gradual decline, but of one sudden event that blotted out the sky and ended an age.
The dinosaurs never saw it coming. They were not prepared. No creature could be. When the sunlight was erased, it wasn't just energy that vanished. It was the code of life, the rhythm of time, the beat of existence. When light left, so did the heartbeat of the world. And yet, in the ashes, life waited. Evolution does not stop. It does not mourn. It reshapes. It selects. It begins again. But in the age of darkness, before mammals would rise, before forests would regrow, before birds would soar again in blue skies, there was only the stillness of a planet mourning its own memory. The skies had dimmed, the fires had cooled, the oceans had stilled. But the true weight of the extinction was only just beginning to settle. Across the entire planet, life was unraveling. This was not a single moment of death, but a prolonged silence spreading through every ecosystem. Extinction did not arrive as a dramatic end, but as a long and creeping absence. This was the Great Dying. Species that had survived the initial blast, the firestorms, the tsunamis, and the collapse of sunlight, were now facing a world where everything familiar had vanished. The web of life had snapped. What had taken hundreds of millions of years to build was disintegrating in weeks, in months, in slow motion. No corner of the planet remained untouched. From forest canopy to ocean trench, from swampland to desert, extinction was swallowing everything. The great dinosaurs, once towering over the land, had been reduced to scattered bones and empty nests. Herbivores that once thundered in herds now died alone, their rib cages exposed, their eyes dull, their stomachs empty. The Tyrannosaurus rex, once apex predator of the continent, now wandered without purpose. With no prey left, with no shelter from the cold, it faded into history, not with a roar, but with hunger. In the air, silence reigned. The pterosaurs, with wingspans stretching wider than any bird that would ever come after, were gone. Their nesting cliffs were blackened. Their soaring cries no longer echoed over the seas. Birds that managed to survive found fewer insects, fewer seeds, fewer safe branches. Many simply vanished. Beneath the water, the great marine reptiles followed the same fate. Mosasaurs, once gliding through warm, shallow seas with jaws wide open, were now ghosts. Their prey had disappeared. The plankton was gone. The fish were few. Without the base of the food chain, the sea's giants collapsed like the lands. Plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and ammonites, creatures that had defined the oceans for generations, were reduced to fossils within a few generations. Reefs turned pale. Ocean currents lost their heat. The chemistry of seawater changed as acid spread and oxygen retreated. Zones of death expanded beneath the waves. Marine life gasped in the shadows of its former world. Mollusks, corals, and microscopic organisms perished by the billions. The ocean floor became a graveyard of shells. On land, insects that once pollinated flowers and recycled the dead suffered massive losses. Beetles, flies, ants, and bees found fewer plants, fewer hosts, fewer places to go. The intricate balance between flora and fauna collapsed. Pollination halted. Decomposition slowed. Life stalled. Only the most adaptable, the smallest, the most resilient remained. Mammals no larger than rats, hiding in underground burrows, emerged only when safe. Their diets were varied, their needs were small. They ate roots, seeds, insects, even the remains of the dead. Their fur protected them from the cold. Their small size let them hide in places large creatures could never reach. Amphibians, too, found a way through the darkness. Frogs and salamanders that could live in damp, hidden shelters waited patiently.
Reptiles like lizards and turtles, less dependent on food and temperature, survived in isolated refuges. Some birds, clinging to trees stripped of leaves, held on with grit and chance. The Great Dying was not a uniform wave. It hit some places harder than others. North America, closer to the impact, suffered more immediate devastation. Continents farther from the crater endured slower decline. But even the most remote forests, the highest mountains, and the deepest lakes could not escape the consequences. This was a planetary extinction, a reset. More than 75% of all species disappeared. Entire families, orders, and classes were erased. Evolution's branches were sheared off. Some animals vanished entirely. Others left behind only fragments, a bone, a footprint, a layer of ash. And yet, extinction is not the end of the planet. It is the end of a chapter. The Great Dying cleared the stage for something new. In the silence that followed, life waited. Evolution paused but did not stop. The dinosaurs were gone. The mighty sauropods, the horned ceratopsians, the duck-billed hadrosaurs, the armored ankylosaurs, the swift dromaeosaurs, the terrifying Tyrannosaurus rex, all gone. What remained of them would be locked in stone, their bones buried beneath sediment and time, their skin impressions, their nests, their last moments fossilized. Plants regrew slowly. After years, the darkness lifted. The sun, once erased, began to warm the surface again. The first green shoots emerged in blackened soil. Ferns returned before trees. Moss crept over the ruins of forests. Fungi retreated. With the return of light came the return of growth. But it was not the same world. Mammals began to rise, not in glory, but in silence. They spread slowly across the empty landscapes, filling niches left behind by the vanished giants. They climbed trees, dug tunnels, hunted at night, and gave birth to new kinds of life. Birds, descendants of small feathered dinosaurs, took to the skies again. With every new generation, they changed, adapted, and became something different. The Earth's silence would not last forever. Over millions of years, sound returned. Footsteps of small animals across forest floors, the flapping of new wings, the breathing of creatures that had never seen a Tyrannosaurus rex, never swam with a mosasaur, never heard the thunder of a herd. Scientists call this moment in time the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. It marked the end of the Mesozoic era and the beginning of the Cenozoic. But in truth, it was more than just a boundary. It was a turning point, a reshaping of life's destiny. Extinction is brutal, it is merciless, but it is also a part of Earth's rhythm. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the planet's history. This was one of them, the most famous, the most violent, the one that made room for us. Because in the shadow of this great dying, the seeds of our world were planted. Without the asteroid, without the darkness, without the silence, mammals may have never risen. Primates may have never emerged. Humans may have never stood under the sky and wondered what had come before them. In the layers of the Earth, this moment is recorded forever. A thin band of iridium, soot, and shattered life. A line drawn across time that says, here is where the giants fell. The Great Dying was not just the end of the dinosaurs, it was the beginning of everything that came after. In the aftermath of the extinction, as the fires cooled and the skies slowly began to clear, the planet stood still. It was a broken world, stripped of giants, hollowed by silence, and wounded by cold. But deep beneath the ash, beneath the soil, in the cracks of rock and pockets of shadow, something endured. The survivors of the void were not the dominant creatures of the past. They were not strong or fast or large. They were quiet, hidden, and often overlooked. Yet they would inherit the earth. In the absence of sunlight, in a world without forests or steady seasons, it was the small that survived. Mammals, once living in the shadow of dinosaurs, now stepped cautiously into a world emptied of rulers. Most were tiny, no larger than squirrels, and spent their lives in burrows or under leaf litter. They fed on insects, roots, carrion, and seeds. Some could lower their metabolic rates, entering a state of torpor, waiting out the worst of the darkness and cold. They did not need much, only shelter and time. And time, finally, was on their side. Many of these mammals had already evolved during the Cretaceous, but their presence had been minimal, their ecological roles limited. They were nocturnal, fast-breeding, and adaptable. They had fur to regulate their body temperature. They bore live young. These traits, once secondary advantages, now became critical tools for survival. While the dinosaurs collapsed in the open, the mammals persisted underground. Birds, too, emerged from the ashes. Not all had survived, but some had. The ones that did were small, beaked, and highly mobile. They were likely seed eaters or insect foragers, able to find scraps of nourishment even in the thinnest soils. Their hollow bones and feathered bodies helped them escape fires and floods. They flew when they could, ran when they had to, and nested in places the fires had not reached. These birds were the direct descendants of small theropod dinosaurs. They were the last link to the ancient reptilian lineage that had once ruled the skies. Reptiles like lizards, snakes, and turtles also held on. Many could go long periods without food. Some hibernated through the darkness. Others found refuge in crevices, swamps, or shallow caves. Their cold-blooded physiology allowed them to slow their energy needs to almost nothing. They did not thrive, but they endured. Amphibians, creatures of moisture and shadow, also proved resilient. Frogs, salamanders, and caecilians clung to damp places, sheltered from heat and acid rain. They bred in isolated ponds and temporary wetlands that had escaped contamination. Although many species were lost, enough survived to begin again when conditions improved. Insects, too, though severely reduced, began to repopulate the world. Some species had laid eggs that could remain dormant through hostile seasons. Others found food in decaying organic matter. Beetles, ants, and flies returned to the dying forests, feeding on rot, waste, and the occasional remaining flower. They became the first wave of life to crawl back over the ruins. Fungi were everywhere. During the extinction, as plants collapsed and animals fell, fungi thrived. They fed on the dead and recycled nutrients into the soil. Mycelium webs spread across charred landscapes, breaking down what remained. In a world where photosynthesis had failed, decomposition became the engine of life. Without fungi, recovery would have been impossible. They were the silent engineers of rebirth. Beneath the ground and deep in the oceans, microbes continued their invisible labor. They metabolized sulfur near hydrothermal vents. They fixed nitrogen in damaged soils. They processed carbon in acid-choked lakes. Their presence kept essential cycles moving even when most of the biosphere had stalled. They were the ancient survivors, unchanged through catastrophe, carrying life's flame in the darkest places. These were not the creatures that shaped the age of dinosaurs. They were not the icons of the Mesozoic. They were not beautiful or terrible, but they were tenacious. And it was their tenacity that the planet needed now. When the void consumed everything, it was the small, the hidden, and the humble who stayed. For years after the impact, the Earth remained unstable. Climate shifted violently. Storms rolled in without warning.
Rain still carried acid. Sunlight returned slowly, filtered through layers of soot and gas. The atmosphere struggled to recover. Seasons came back, but they were irregular. In some regions, ecosystems began to reform. In others, life waited in fragments. As plants regrew, they did so in patches. Ferns were among the first to recolonize. They spread through spores, fast and adaptable. These fern spikes, as recorded in the fossil record, mark the return of vegetation after mass destruction. Grasses, shrubs, and flowering plants followed. They attracted insects. Insects attracted amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The cycle of life rebuilt itself, one layer at a time. The survivors spread slowly. Without competition from large herbivores or carnivores, mammals diversified. Some grew larger, others took to trees. A few returned to water. Birds began to occupy the skies once ruled by pterosaurs. They developed new calls, new beaks, new behaviors. Reptiles returned to sunlit rocks and jungle floors. Each generation brought change. Over millions of years, these survivors evolved into the dominant creatures of the Cenozoic. The age of mammals began not with a roar, but with a whisper. In the places where the void had failed to kill everything, life wrote a new story. And still, the memory of the extinction remained, embedded in rocks, encoded in genes, traced in the shape of ecosystems. The gap left by the dinosaurs would never be filled, only transformed. The survivors of the void had not won a battle. They had endured a trial. They were not greater or smarter than the species that perished. They were only luckier, more flexible, and built to withstand the collapse of all things. They carried forward the genetic heritage of life through a filter of fire, ice, and ash. Without them, there would be no forests, no mammals, no humans. The world as we know it was born in the ruins of the one that came before. The void had almost taken everything, but not quite. When the dust finally settled, when the skies cleared and the heat faded, the earth was quiet. The age of dinosaurs had ended, and in their place stood nothing. A silence, a pause in the great rhythm of life. But nature does not accept emptiness for long. From the ashes and shadows, from the soil and stone, life began again. It did not rush or roar. It crept, it climbed, it unfurled. A new beginning was unfolding. The first signs were green, not towering trees or thick forests, but simple ferns, mosses, and low shrubs. They took root in scorched ground, in places where fire had once consumed everything. They sprouted from cracks in volcanic stone, from the edges of lifeless swamps. Spores carried by wind, seeds dropped by birds that had endured. Photosynthesis resumed. Carbon dioxide became food. Oxygen returned to the air. With plant life came the restoration of soil. Roots held the ground in place. Decomposing leaves fed the microorganisms below. Fungi retreated into balance, no longer consuming, now cooperating. The cycle that had been broken began to turn again. As vegetation spread, so did the animals that had survived the void. Mammals emerged from their burrows, blinking under the sun they had nearly forgotten. They searched the regrowing world for food and shelter. They mated, gave birth, and adapted. Each generation slightly different, slightly better suited to the shifting environment. Some stayed small, others grew. A few returned to the trees, reclaiming the space once filled with flying reptiles. Some ventured into water, chasing fish that had repopulated calmer rivers and lakes. Birds rose with the sun. Their feathers, once just warmth and display, now powered long flights across new landscapes. They followed the plants. They hunted the insects.
They spread seeds and built nests in places untouched by fire. Over time, their songs returned to the forests. Not the same as before, but music nonetheless.
Reptiles expanded outward. Lizards basked on warm rocks. Turtles slid into ponds. Snakes moved through tall grass. Amphibians called from the water's edge. Their survival had been tested, but their resilience proved strong. They found niches where the old giants once roamed. They filled them carefully, gradually, without haste.
In the oceans, life pulsed again. The phytoplankton returned first, floating near the surface, catching the sun and dividing rapidly. This invisible bloom restarted the marine food chain. Zooplankton followed. Small fish reappeared. Corals began to build new reefs. Over time, the seas that had turned silent came alive with motion. Dolphins would come later, whales too, but the foundation was being laid. The world itself changed. The continents continued their drift. Mountains rose. Valleys opened. The climate warmed and cooled in cycles. Ice ages came and went. Deserts formed. Jungles thickened. The scars of the asteroid faded beneath new ecosystems, but they were never truly gone. In the rocks, in the bones, in the genetic memory of life, the great extinction remained. Mammals, once timid and hidden, became the architects of this new age. They evolved into countless forms: hoofed grazers, predators with fangs and claws, primates with hands and curious eyes. Over millions of years, their diversity exploded across the planet. Evolution favored intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation. Complex behaviors appeared. Social groups formed. Tool use began. The spark of something new flickered in the eyes of certain species. One day, one of those species would look up at the stars and wonder how it had all begun. But long before that, the planet healed. Not back to what it was, but forward into something new. The Cretaceous was gone. The Paleogene had begun. An age defined not by dinosaurs, but by recovery and reinvention. This new beginning was not a gift. It was a result of survival, of endurance, of chance. The asteroid did not create life. It only cleared the board. What came after was the product of everything that had come before, shaped by extinction and powered by persistence. In time, forests would rise again. Animals would walk paths no dinosaur ever touched. Oceans would fill with species unimagined. And one day, footprints would appear in the soil that had once been ash. Those footprints would not belong to titans or giants, but to beings that remembered, beings that studied bones, read rocks, and listened to the whispers of the earth, beings that would name the dinosaurs, that would dig up their fossils, piece together their stories, and stare up the sky knowing what once fell from it. The crater would still be there, buried in the Yucatan, overgrown and eroded. But its impact would echo in every species that came after, in every mammal, every bird, every forest, every ocean, including us. The age of dinosaurs ended in fire, flood, and silence, but life continued. It always does. And from that silence came a new story. Our story.